She was at the end of her shift when they came through the door. 4 of them still carrying the quiet of wherever they had come from, that particular absence of noise that certain people bring into a room when they have been in places where sound was dangerous. They walked past the nursing station, past the charge desk, past 2 physicians who looked up and said nothing, and they stopped in front of her. She was holding a chart. Her badge said her name and her title, nurse, and nothing else. The one in front looked at her for a moment. Then he said, clearly and without hesitation, that they were there to see her. And he called her ma'am in the way that word means something specific when it comes from a man like that. The room went very still. The oncology ward at Bethesda Naval Hospital was not a place where unusual things stopped being unusual. It was the kind of environment that had absorbed enough of the exceptional, enough diagnoses delivered in careful language, enough families sitting with information they did not know how to hold, enough recoveries and enough failures, that most of the staff who had been there long enough had developed a baseline tolerance for the weight of the work that kept them functional. I had been there for 3 years. Not long enough to be senior in the way that tenure becomes identity, but long enough to have found my footing in the specific rhythms of the ward, the rotation schedules, the dynamics between the attending physicians and the nursing staff, the particular way that an oncology environment moves between routine and urgency without ever fully separating the two. My name was on my badge. My title was below it. Those 2 things were, in the professional context of the ward, the complete public description of who I was. They were sufficient for the work. I had not offered more than they contained, and no one had asked. The ward's culture was built around a hierarchy that had been in place long enough to have become invisible, the kind of hierarchy that does not feel like hierarchy to the people inside it, because they have never experienced the space without it. Physicians at the apex, resident physicians below them, nursing staff below that, corpsmen and orderlies at the base. The hierarchy was not cruel in any formal sense. It was simply the structure through which everything moved, and understanding it accurately was the first requirement for functioning inside it. The physicians I worked with most closely were a mixed group. Dr. Calloway was the attending who ran our section of the ward, a man in his early 50s who had been in military medicine for 22 years, and who had developed, over that time, a particular style of authority that was efficient and occasionally narrow. He was not a bad physician. He made good decisions about patient care. His narrowness was social rather than clinical. He had organized the ward into categories of relevance and had not recently updated the categorization. Below him, 2 residents, Alvarez, who was energetic and technically sharp, and who managed his uncertainty by performing confidence at a volume slightly higher than the situation required, and Park, who was quieter and more careful, and who I had come to trust more than Alvarez precisely because of the care. The nursing staff was a group I had integrated into over 3 years with the usual mixture of friction and rapport that comes from shared work under pressure. Delgado was the charge nurse on my wing, a woman who had been at Bethesda for 9 years and who ran the floor with the specific authority of someone who had outlasted 3 department restructurings and knew where everything actually was. She was the person you went to when you needed the true answer to a question rather than the administrative one. Beside Delgado in my daily working landscape were Torres, Osai, and a corpsman named Webb who was young enough to still find everything interesting, which I found useful as a counterweight to my own more calibrated relationship with the work. I had built a functional life inside this ward. I came in, I did the work, I documented, I went home. The work was serious, and I took it seriously. I did not perform casualness about the patients I cared for or the conditions they were managing. Some of them were going to recover. Some were not. I knew which was which in most cases before the physicians formally communicated the prognosis, because 4 years of nursing before Bethesda and 3 years in this specific ward had given me the capacity to read certain progressions accurately. What I did not display in this environment was anything about myself that went beyond what the badge communicated. Not because I was hiding it exactly, it was in my personnel file accessible to anyone with appropriate clearance, but because the work did not require it and the culture did not invite it, and I had learned in the years before nursing that the most useful things you carry are often the things that are not announced. I had come from somewhere before this ward. The badge did not say where. Most people did not ask. I had been, in that not asking, comfortable and invisible in equal measure. The comfortable invisibility was about to end. The thing that started it, though I did not know it was starting anything at the time, was a patient admission in the 4th month of that year. His name was Commander Gerald Foss, retired. 61 years old, referred from an outpatient oncology clinic for inpatient management of a treatment complication. a blood count issue following his third cycle of chemotherapy for a diagnosis that was, by that point, several months old. He had been managing his treatment at the outpatient level and had now reached a threshold that required closer monitoring. He arrived with his wife, who was composed in the specific way that spouses of ill people become composed after long enough, not unaffected but practiced at moving alongside the effect without being stopped by it. She asked the right questions. She had a notebook. She had been doing this for long enough to know which answers mattered. Foss himself was cooperative and somewhat remote. He answered what he was asked with economy, did not elaborate, did not ask many questions of his own. He had the quality of a man who had organized himself around the idea that the illness was a thing happening to his body and that his actual self was separate from it, which is a coping structure I recognized and respected without assuming it would hold indefinitely. I was assigned to his care on the second day of his admission. Delgado rotated the assignments regularly, and there was nothing unusual about the selection. I introduced myself, reviewed his history, assessed his current status, and documented. He responded to me with the same economy he had offered everyone else, politely, briefly, without particular engagement. What I noticed, which I filed without examining, was a small hesitation when I said my name, not a significant pause. A fraction of a second's additional processing before he nodded and continued the intake exchange. It was the kind of hesitation that has 100 mundane explanations and one non-mundane one, and in the context of an initial meeting with a new patient, the mundane explanations were statistically dominant. I noted it and moved on. The discomfort I am describing was not dramatic in those early days. It was atmospheric, a faint sense building gradually that something in the environment around me was slightly differently arranged than it appeared. Not threatening, not specific, just a low-level awareness that information was moving in a way that was not visible to me but that I could feel in the space between interactions. Dr. Calloway began being somewhat more formal with me during the daily rounds in Foss's room. Not cold, he was not capable of cold in any conventional sense, but more precise, more careful about the professional register of his communication, as though he were performing a version of collegial respect that he had not previously felt required by our working relationship. I noticed this. I did not raise it. There was nothing to raise, it was a shift in tone, not a statement, and tones shift for dozens of reasons in any working environment. Torres mentioned to me one afternoon that Foss had asked her a question about my background. She said he had asked it casually, in the middle of a routine interaction, almost as an afterthought, whether I had been in the military before nursing. She said she had told him she didn't have details on that and had suggested he ask me directly if he was curious. He had not asked me directly. I sat with this for the remainder of that shift without fully landing on what it meant. That a patient was curious about a nurse's background was not unusual. That this particular patient was curious about this particular aspect of this particular nurse's background had a slightly different texture, but I could not have articulated why without sounding like I was constructing a meaning that was not there. I went home. I made dinner. I thought about the hesitation on the first day and Torres' report of the question and Calloway's slightly altered register, and I considered whether these things were related or coincidental. I did not reach a conclusion. I let it sit, which was the most honest response to incomplete information. I had learned in the years before this ward that the cost of concluding too early was higher than the cost of waiting. I went back to work the next morning. Foss was in his room. His wife had brought him a book. He was reading it when I entered for the morning assessment, and he put it down with the same economy he used for everything, and he looked at me in a way that was slightly more direct than it had been the day before. I did not comment on the directness. I did the assessment. The question came on the 5th day, and it came from Calloway rather than from Foss, which was the thing that told me the information had moved in a direction I had not fully tracked. Calloway found me in the chart room in the mid-afternoon, not at the nursing station, not during rounds, but in the quieter space that was specifically not a high-traffic location. And he said, with the careful precision I had been observing for 2 weeks, that he had a question about my background that he hoped I would not find intrusive. I said he could ask. He said he had heard, through what he characterized as informal channels, that I had had a significant prior military career before transitioning to nursing. He said he wanted to understand my background better in the context of managing Commander Foss's care, because Foss had, according to what he described as an indirect communication through the hospital's command liaison office, expressed a preference for understanding who his care providers were. That was a great deal of careful language to describe something that could have been stated simply. I had been in enough institutional environments to understand that the volume of care taken with language is usually inversely proportional to the comfort of the speaker with the content. I said my prior service history was documented in my personnel file and available to anyone with appropriate access. He said he understood that, and that the informal conversation he was having with me was intended to be separate from the formal record, a collegial exchange rather than an administrative inquiry. I said I understood the distinction. I said I was happy to tell him that I had served before nursing, and that the specifics of that service were something I kept separate from my professional identity here, not because they were secret, but because they were mine, and I had not found them operationally relevant to nursing care at Bethesda. He was quiet for a moment. He was parsing something in what I had said, and I watched him parse it, the specific look of a man trying to determine whether he had been told something or denied something. I had told him something, and I had done so accurately. I had served. The specifics were mine. Both of those things were true. He thanked me and left. The conversation had lasted 6 minutes and had produced exactly as much information as I had chosen to offer, which was both everything and nothing depending on what the asker was looking for. The red flags, by this point, had assembled themselves into a shape I could name. Foss had recognized my name. He had asked Torres about my background. That inquiry had reached Calloway through what Calloway described as a command liaison communication, which meant it had traveled upward before coming back down to me, which meant someone above Calloway's position had been involved in the routing. Calloway's altered register in Foss's room, the informal conversation in the chart room. None of these things were hostile. None of them were wrong, exactly. But they added up to a picture of information moving around me rather than to me, and of a patient whose curiosity about my background had activated something in the institutional machinery that I had not activated and could not fully see. I told Delgado that evening, as precisely and briefly as I could. I said I had the sense that something was moving in the ward in relation to Foss's care and my involvement in it, and that I was not certain of its nature, and that I wanted her to know I had that sense in case it became relevant. She listened without interrupting. Then she said she had noticed Calloway's adjusted manner also, and that she had filed it in the same provisional way I had. She said she thought we should let it develop rather than push at it, because pushing at institutional processes before they had completed their motion often produced nothing except the awareness that you had been pushing. That was wise advice. I knew it was wise advice. I followed it. But I went home that night with the specific discomfort of someone who knows that a conversation has been had about them, in rooms they were not in, by people whose relationship to them they do not fully understand. It is not a comfortable thing. Even when the conversation is not hostile, even when the people are not enemies, the experience of being the subject of a discussion you are not part of has a particular quality that is hard to absorb neutrally. I absorbed it as neutrally as I could. I went to bed. I came back in the morning, and the morning after that, Foss's wife arrived earlier than usual and asked to speak with me privately. What Mrs. Foss said to me in the family consultation room was this. Her husband had recognized my name from a report he had seen 7 years ago, in a context she was not at liberty to describe specifically, and that the recognition had produced a response in him that was affecting his willingness to engage with his care team in the way that was necessary for his treatment to proceed effectively. She said it carefully. She was a careful person. She had been living alongside a man who dealt in careful language for 40 years and had absorbed some of it. I said I understood what she was telling me and asked if she could tell me more about the nature of his response. She said that her husband had strong feelings about certain aspects of a particular operation that had occurred 7 years ago. She said she was not in a position to discuss the operation itself, and she wanted me to understand she was not accusing me of anything. She said she was simply conveying that his feelings were real and that they were affecting his current situation. I sat with this for a moment. 7 years ago, a report, an operation, the specific, careful way she was not naming any of these things was itself a form of information. I said I appreciated her telling me directly and that I would speak to the charge nurse about whether a rotation adjustment might be in order. She thanked me. She said she hoped I understood. I said I did. I was not certain that was entirely true, but I understood enough. I spoke to Delgado. Delgado went to Calloway. Calloway went apparently back to the command liaison office. What came back down the chain was something I had not anticipated in its form, though I had perhaps anticipated something in its general shape. Calloway found me the following afternoon and told me, with the particular careful tone he had been using for 2 weeks, that given the patient's history and the nature of his treatment relationship with the ward, Command had suggested that it would be appropriate for me to be rotated off Foss's care assignments for the duration of his admission. He said the suggestion had been made with full acknowledgement of my competence and with no reflection on my professional standing. He said the phrase, "no reflection on your professional standing," the way people say things that they know sound exactly like what they are trying to say they are not. I said I understood. Delgado, who was present for this conversation, said nothing during it. Afterward, when Calloway had left, she looked at me and said what she thought of the decision in one sentence. She said it was wrong. She said it in the flat way she said true things, without elaboration, without apology for saying it. I said I knew. I also said the decision had been made, and that arguing it through Calloway was unlikely to produce a different outcome, and that I was going to continue doing my work with my other patients, and let the situation develop rather than resist it through channels that were not going to hold my resistance. What I did not say to Delgado was how the removal felt, not the professional surface of it, that I could manage and had managed versions of before. The specific feeling underneath. The feeling of being the subject of a complaint based on something I had done 7 years ago, in a context I was not at liberty to discuss, in a world that Foss and I had both inhabited, and that was not represented anywhere on my badge, and being managed around that complaint rather than through it. Being managed around. That was the most precise description. I was not being confronted with something. I was being moved out of the way of something, which is a different experience and in some ways a harder one because the thing being moved around never gets addressed. It just continues to occupy the space you vacated. Webb asked me the next morning with the directness of his relative youth if I was all right. I said I was. He said he had noticed the rotation change and that it seemed off to him. I said I appreciated his saying so. He stood there for a moment longer than the exchange required. He was trying to offer something more and had not found the form for it yet. He was 23 years old and still operating in a world where things that were wrong should be nameable and the naming should produce a response. I remembered that world. I did not tell him when exactly I had left it. I told him the shift needed starting and that we should get to it. He nodded. We went to work. I carried the removed status through the shift the way I carried most things, steadily, without letting it show, feeling it fully and privately. The understanding came from Foss himself, which I had not expected. On the 8th day of his admission, 3 days after my rotation removal, I was at the nursing station completing documentation when I heard my name. Not from a colleague, from the direction of Foss's room. I looked up. His door was open and he was sitting upright in his bed, looking down the hallway toward the station with the expression of a man who had made a decision he was slightly uncertain about. He said my name again. He said it in the specific way of someone requesting a voluntary interaction rather than summoning a service. The distinction was in the tone, a request, not an expectation. I went to his room. I stood in the doorway. I said I was listening. He said he owed me a conversation that he should have had directly rather than through intermediaries. He said the way he had handled the situation, the conversation through his wife, the involvement of the command liaison had not been the right approach, and he was aware of that. He said he needed to tell me what he recognized so that I could tell him whether his recognition was accurate, because if it was not accurate, then what had happened in the past 3 days was something he was responsible for correcting. I said I was listening. He said that 7 years ago, he had read a classified after-action report relating to a specific operation in a region he did not name. He said the report had included an account of a medical officer whose actions during an extraction sequence had been significant. The specific word used in the report had been significant, which was military language for something that mattered in a way that the bureaucratic vocabulary was insufficient to fully contain. He said the medical officer's name had been in the report. He said my name was the name in the report. He stopped there. He was looking at me with the careful attention of a man who understood that he might have done something and who was waiting to find out whether he had. I was quiet for a moment. I was deciding not what to say was clear, but how much to say. There is always more than one level of what to say, and the selection between levels is its own kind of decision. I said I could not confirm or deny the specifics of any classified report or operation. I said that was not deflection, it was the accurate constraint of my situation. He said he understood that. He asked if he could ask one question that did not require me to confirm or deny anything classified. I said he could ask. He said, had I served in a context that required a security clearance above the standard military level? I said yes. He nodded. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said that the reason my name had produced the response it had produced was that in the report he had read, the medical officer's actions had prevented the death of a service member who was currently still alive. He said the service member was someone he cared about. He said his response to my name had been an emotional one that he had not managed well, and that he was sorry for the outcome of his poor management. I stood in the doorway and processed this. It was not what I had expected. I had expected what? Some continuation of the careful routing around me, some further administrative resolution that would not require him to address me directly. What I had not expected was accountability delivered this simply, this directly, without institutional cover. He said he had also made a call. He said it the way people say things that they have decided to say and cannot unsay. He said he had contacted someone who had been trying to reach me for some time, and that he had been given permission by that person to tell me that the contact was coming. I said I did not know what that meant. He said it would become clear. He said he was sorry for the disruption to my work, and that he hoped it would be corrected quickly. I stood in the doorway for another moment. Then I said that I appreciated his speaking directly, and that I hoped his recovery would proceed well. I meant both of those things. I went back to the nursing station. I sat down with my documentation and I tried to locate the feeling the conversation had produced. It was not a simple feeling. It was layered in the way that things are layered when they touch more than one part of your history at once. The part that was standing here in Bethesda in scrubs with a badge, and the part that was somewhere else, 7 years ago, in conditions that did not appear anywhere on the badge. The two parts of me sat with each other for a moment at the nursing station, in the particular way they had always sat with each other, not in conflict, but not quite integrated either. Delgado came by and said my name. I looked up. She said there were 4 individuals in the main entrance asking to see me. They were not in uniform, which was a deliberate choice I recognized immediately. People who operate in certain contexts learn to move in civilian clothes in institutional settings in a way that is so practiced it no longer reads as disguise. It reads simply as how they exist. But there are other things that do not come off with the uniform. The way they stood, the specific orientation of their attention, the economy of their movement through a space that was unfamiliar to them. 4 of them. The one in front was somewhere in his late 30s, lean and unhurried, with eyes that moved the way eyes move when they have been trained to take in a full room before settling on a specific target. He found me at the nursing station before I had reached the halfway point of the corridor, and he held the location with the quiet accuracy of someone who has identified a specific coordinate. He said my name. He said it with a clarity that made clear he was not searching for me. He had already found me and was simply completing the interaction. I said yes. He said they were there to see me. And he said ma'am with the specific weight that word carries when it comes from a person of that specific background addressing a person of my specific history. It is not a courtesy word in that context. It is an acknowledgement. It is the verbal equivalent of a certain kind of recognition between people who have been in the same world and know what the world costs. The ward had gone quiet around us. Not dramatically, the machinery of the ward continued, monitors, distant voices, the background audio of a functional medical floor. But the human layer of it had stilled. Delgado was at the charge desk and had not moved. Torres was at the supply cabinet and had not moved. Calloway had emerged from the physician area and was standing near the doorway to the chart room with an expression that I could only describe as reconfiguring. I said they should come with me to the family consultation room, which was the only private space available on the wing. They came. The 4 of them arranged themselves in the room with the natural efficiency of people accustomed to occupying spaces in coordinated ways. The one who had spoken sat directly across from me. The others positioned themselves at points that were not accidental. He told me his name, his unit designation, and his current assignment. All 3 of those things constituted more disclosure than people from that world typically offer in an initial interaction, which meant the disclosure was itself a form of communication, an indication that this conversation was not going to be managed in the usual way. He said they had been looking for me for approximately 2 years. He said this not as an accusation, but as a statement of effort, an acknowledgement of how long a thing had been in motion. He said the process of finding me had been complicated by the fact that my personnel transition from prior service to nursing had been managed in a way that, while not intentionally obscuring, had placed my new identity in a separate administrative system that was not easily cross-linked to the prior one. He said that Commander Foss's recognition of my name had been the mechanism through which the crosslink had finally been made. I said I understood and asked what the purpose of finding me was. He said the purpose was twofold. The first was to notify me formally that an action relating to the operation 7 years ago, the one Foss had referenced obliquely, had been recommended, processed, and approved at the appropriate level, and that my transfer out of the prior service before the processing was complete had interrupted the notification sequence. He said the notification was now being completed in person, which was the appropriate method for notifications of this category. He said the second purpose was to ask if I was willing to receive a visitor. He said the visitor was someone I had provided care to during the extraction sequence referenced in the after-action report, and that this person had asked, through channels, for the opportunity to meet me. I sat with this for a moment that was longer than the room expected. The 2 years of looking, the cross-linked records. The after-action report that Foss had read, and that had produced the chain of events currently sitting across from me in the family consultation room. 7 years ago, in conditions I did not describe in this ward and had not described to anyone in this ward, I had done work that I had filed in the same internal archive where I kept all the work from that period. Not forgotten, that is not the right word. Archived in the specific way that you archive things that are too heavy to carry in your active mental landscape, but that you have not and cannot let go of entirely. The work had apparently not stayed archived. It had traveled, through report language and command channels, and a retired naval officer's recognition of a name on a badge, and had arrived in this room in the form of 4 men in civilian clothes who had spent 2 years finding me. I said I was willing to receive the visitor. The man across from me nodded. He said the visitor would arrive the following morning. He said they appreciated my time. He said ma'am again when he stood with the same specific weight as the first time. They left. I sat in the consultation room alone for several minutes. Delgado knocked on the door and opened it and looked at me. She said nothing. She was reading the room. I said I was all right. She said she would need me to tell her something more useful than that at some point. I said I would. She closed the door and gave me another minute. I used the minute. Then I went back to work because the shift had not ended and the patients had not stopped needing care, and those facts did not pause for anything that was happening to me. I did not sleep in the way that sleep is supposed to work. I lay in the dark of my apartment, and I was present to it, fully awake, fully in my body, my mind moving through the events of the day with the particular unwillingness to land that comes when something has arrived that you are not ready to integrate. Let me try to describe what the previous 7 years had actually been. I had served in a special operations support role. The specific designation is not something I will reproduce here, not because of any formal restriction, but because the specifics are beside the point I am trying to make. What matters for this account is the nature of the work, which was this. I was a medical officer in environments where the standard of care and the standard of survival existed in constant tension, where what was possible and what was necessary were often not the same thing, and where the decisions made in specific moments had consequences that could not be revisited. The extraction sequence that Foss had referenced in the after-action report, the one the 4 men in the consultation room had traveled here to close, had been one of those moments. I had been the medical officer on scene. Someone had been wounded in a way that required a specific sequence of decisions made in a specific order with no margin for error and no second chance. I had made those decisions. The person had lived. I had left the service the following year. Not because of that event, the decision had been building for longer than that, had roots in the accumulated weight of the work and the specific human cost of doing it correctly over time. I had transitioned to nursing with the deliberate intention of continuing to keep people alive in conditions that were less extreme and more sustainable for the long term of a life. I had not carried the extraction into my nursing identity. I had not carried most of what I had done. I had built a new professional self in this ward, in this hospital with this badge, and that self was real and was mine and was not a diminishment of what had come before. It was a continuation of the same purpose in a different form. What the previous 24 hours had done was make the wall between those two selves permeable in a way I had not experienced since the transition. Foss's recognition, the 4 men, the notification, the visitor coming in the morning. I lay in the dark and I felt the wall becoming permeable, and I tried to decide how I felt about that. It was not simple. On one side of the feeling was something I would cautiously describe as relief, the specific relief of something that has been held apart for a long time being, finally, allowed to be in the same room as everything else. I had been 2 things for 7 years, and had lived that division mostly as a professional necessity, and occasionally as a loneliness I had not fully named. The wall had also kept certain things from reaching me. The weight of the work from the prior life had stayed on its side of the wall, and that containment had been functional. The visitor coming in the morning was going to breach the wall more fully than anything had breached it since I left the service. Someone from the extraction. Someone alive because of decisions I had made in a specific moment. I did not know who. I had cared for several people in that sequence and had not known all of them by name in the way you know the names of people in ordinary circumstances. What I felt, underneath the relief and alongside the specific weight of the wall becoming permeable, was something harder to name. Something close to grief, though not grief for anything lost, grief for the years of distance from something that had mattered. The work before the ward had mattered. I had let it go because it needed to be let go for the continuation to be possible, but letting go of something that matters is still a loss, even when it is the right thing to do. I lay in the dark, and I allowed all of that to be present. I did not manage it into something more comfortable or more resoluble. I let it be what it was: complicated, layered, real. Sometime around 3 in the morning, I became aware that I had been holding myself very still in the way that I held myself still in environments where stillness was necessary, and I made the conscious decision to let my body relax. It took longer than it should have. That told me something about how deeply the prior self was still present underneath the nursing ward surface of my daily life. I was not the badge. I was not only the badge. I had always known this. But knowing it and feeling it in the specific, embodied way of this particular night were different experiences, and the felt version had more weight than the known version. The morning came. I got up. I drove to the hospital. I changed into my scrubs. I pinned my badge to my chest. I went in to meet whoever was coming. He arrived at 9:15 in the morning. He came without the 4 men. He came alone, with a quiet that was different from their operational quiet. His was the quiet of someone managing something internal. He was in his mid-30s, civilian clothes, moving with a slight asymmetry in his gait that was consistent with a resolved but permanent injury. He did not say anything immediately when he saw me. He stood at the entrance to the family consultation room where Delgado had brought him, and he looked at me with the particular expression of someone who has been carrying a thing for a long time and is now in the presence of the person they have been carrying it toward. And the reality of that arrival is both more and less than what the years of carrying had imagined. I said his name. I did not know his name. Delgado had given it to me when she came to find me, but I said it, and the saying of it collapsed some of the distance between the 9:15 of this morning and the night 7 years ago when I had known him in a completely different context. He said mine. He said it the way the 4 men had said ma'am, with a specific weight that was not social convention but acknowledgement. The acknowledgement of one person who has been in a real place to another person who has been in the same real place. We sat down. He told me that he had been trying to find me since approximately 18 months after the extraction. He said the administrative transition I had made from prior service to nursing had made the search non-trivial. He said when Foss had made contact through the command liaison with the information that he had found me at Bethesda, the 4 men had been organized and here within 48 hours. He said he wanted me to know what the years had looked like. Not as an accounting that I was owed, he was careful to frame it correctly, but because he thought the information mattered, and he had wanted to be the one to deliver it in person rather than through a report. He described the years. He was alive. He had recovered, with limitations that were permanent but manageable. He had continued service for 2 years after the extraction before medical separation. He had built a life, work, family, the specific ordinary texture of a life that exists because a certain night had gone one way rather than another. He said all of this plainly, without performance of gratitude or emotion, in the same clean language that people from that world use for things that are important. When he finished, I said I was glad he was here. I meant it in every sense the phrase could carry. He said he was glad too. There was a pause. Then he said that the notification the 4 men had delivered, the formal one, the one relating to the after-action report, carried with it a recognition that would appear in my record. He said he had been asked whether he wanted to be present for the delivery of the notification, and that he had said yes, which was the reason for the coordination of the visit. He said the recognition had been approved at a level above the standard chain, which was why it had required the specific process. He said the details were in the notification document that would be processed through the hospital command. Calloway received the notification document that afternoon. I know this because Delgado told me, and because Calloway's demeanor for the remainder of the day carried the particular quality of a man who has learned something that requires him to revise a significant assumption. He was not cold after that, and he was not performing the careful, formal respect of the previous weeks. He was simply quieter, more present, the specific quietness of someone in the process of adjustment. Delgado told me that Foss had asked whether I would be willing to return to his care rotation for the remainder of his admission if I was amenable. She said the word amenable was his. She said she wanted to know what I wanted. I said I would return to his rotation. I did. The following morning I entered his room for the assessment, and he greeted me by name in the ordinary way of a patient greeting a nurse whose care he had come to trust. His wife was present. She nodded at me with the composed expression of a woman who had been carrying something and had set it down. The assessment was routine. His numbers were moving in the right direction. I documented. I moved to the next patient. The ward returned to itself in the weeks that followed. Not the same self it had been before. That is not how any of this works, not in institutions and not in people, but a version of itself that had integrated what had happened into the ongoing texture of its daily function. Calloway stopped using the careful, formal register with me. What replaced it was something more direct, and in the long run, more workable, a collegial communication that acknowledged what he now knew without making it the constant subject of interaction. That was the appropriate resolution. It was also the one that required the most ongoing adjustment, and I respected that he was making it. Foss completed his admission and was discharged to outpatient management. His final blood counts were stable. His wife shook my hand on the day of discharge and said something brief that I am not going to repeat because it was said privately and was meant privately. I received it that way. The visitor did not contact me again. That was correct. The contact had been made, the communication had been delivered, the years of carrying had been resolved in the specific way that they could be resolved. Additional contact would have changed the nature of what it had been, and what it had been was already complete. I wore my badge every shift. Name, title, nothing else. That had not changed, and it was not going to change because the badge was accurate. I was a nurse, I was here, and the work in front of me was the work that mattered. What had changed was interior and would remain interior because the interior was where it had always lived. I had been two things for 7 years and had lived that as a division. What the previous weeks had done was not collapse the division. The two things remained distinct as they were meant to be. What had changed was the weight of the wall between them. It was lighter now, not gone, just lighter. I clocked in for the morning shift. I reviewed the overnight notes. I went to my first patient. The ward went on, so did I.